Aloha and welcome to part 2 of the custom sword. If you're returning to the channel and you haven't liked or subscribed, please do. It helps out a ton. If you're new, go ahead and watch it through, and if you enjoy, I'd love a subscribe. So in this video, we're going to be continuing working on the custom sword that I have. I have a ton of work left to do. I'm almost done with most of the shaping, and so there's just a little bit of grinding work left on the angle grinder. I think I'm using a 50 grit sanding disc. I kind of switch between a 50 grit and a 36 grit. Kind of depends on how much material I need to remove, but I had that mostly complete in the last video, and so I just had a couple small sections left to do on it, and then I can start working on sanding. Now, I have a ton of sanding to do on this piece, so it has really long, straight edges, which are actually kind of a challenge to make, especially if you don't have a belt sander, which I don't. So I'm still just using my sanding disc here, and then I'll be rotating back and forth between the sanding disc and my chisel set just to clean up the edges and try to make everything a little bit more uniform and a little bit more clean. There's quite a bit of cleanup on this piece. It's not a wide piece, but because it's so elongated, making sure all of the lines and everything stays nice and symmetrical and straight kind of took quite a while. It was a lot more intensive than I was expecting it to be. The chisels that I'm using here are just a 3/4 inch and a 5/8 inch chisel set, and I'm just going back and forth between them, cleaning up the finer edges. I did do some additional rounding down close to where the blade meets the handle. That's kind of a cross guard, but not really. All that actually is going to be is a transition between the blade and what will be the cross guard. It's not really a cross guard. We'll see in a little bit. I still had quite a bit of material left to remove here on the tang. It is a solid wood tang, but there's far too much material there, and so the primary issue is if the tang is too large, then when I go to make the handle, I won't have enough material on the handle material to work down into the tang, just because the tang itself will be too thick. But at the same time, I also don't want to make the tang too thin, otherwise I won't have a nice strong connection point. It'll be a weak point. Now, this is definitely not really a piece that I'm going to be testing with. It's made 100% more for decorative, but like all of my pieces, I still like to make sure that they have a solid construction. That way, if you were to test with it, if you were to use it, it still have some function. The next step here is just going to be grooving in where the shark teeth are going to go. I haven't decided yet as of this point if I was going to use bull shark or tiger shark teeth. I kind of decided bull shark just based off of the overall layout, but as I was working through it, I continued to kind of debate back and forth just to see if I liked it or not. But I'm not quite yet to putting in the teeth. I actually still have quite a bit more to do. When you put the teeth in, it becomes a little bit more difficult to sand, just because the teeth are in the way. And so before I finish the teeth, I'm going to be making up before I put in the teeth, I'm going to be making the crossguard section, or tsubaki, I think is what it's called in Japanese. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm going to be putting in that, and then I'm going to get the handle material ready. I'm not going to be shaping the handle yet, but I'm going to be getting it ready to shape. So this part here, I just grabbed a thin piece of coal wood that I had. It kind of was the perfect thickness. I'm not actually cutting out the shape yet. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out the center section, so that way I don't get my angles wrong. So if I cut it out first and then cut in that center section, I could mess up. I could have it off center. It could be tilted to the left or to the right. So by cutting this out first on the blank before I begin sketching out the actual design of it, that will help prevent me from making an error. And so it's just doing the steps, I guess, in alternating method rather than trying to design the whole thing first and then fit it to it. I'm fitting it to it first and then designing it. But both of these are koa wood. I picked a piece of koa that had some end grain, that lighter grain. I thought that would kind of look cool to have like a two-tone piece of koa that fit up nicely with it. It's looking pretty awesome. I'm really enjoying how this is looking so far. But now that I have this fit up to it, I can go ahead and start to design this out. What I kind of had in my mind was the design would be almost like a diamond pattern. But I ended up not liking how the pointed edges came out. I thought that stuck out too far. And so I ended up bringing those in, and it was kind of a diamond pattern, but two of the ends there cut off shorter. And I really liked the way that looked a lot better. I think dimensionally it had a better flow. And so finishing this piece off is pretty easy. I'm just sanding the whole thing down. I am adding a bevel to all of the edges, but other than that, this is kind of the extent of what I need to do on this piece here. I won't oil it yet. I'm gonna wait to oil it until I'm gonna oil the entire piece altogether. So the sword, the handle material. Well, I might not oil the handle material right away. I'm undecided on that one, but definitely the sword and this cross section here. But once I have this completely sanded up and ready, I can start working on getting the handle material. So I have a really thick piece of koa here. It's a beautiful piece of koa. I'm only going to be using a chunk of it. Part of the reason why I picked it is it's a little bit lighter, and so it should have some contrast between that koa and the blade. And it's also a thicker piece. And so what I did is I spliced it, and it's not straight down the center. So the idea here is I'm going to be putting in the handle material is going to inset into just one of these sections, so that when I go to glue it together, I don't have to try to match them up perfectly. Like if they're off center, it doesn't matter because the inset's only in one side. So the other side will stay perfectly flat, and then when I glue it together, I'll have that perfect cutout that the sword will just slot into, and then I'm going to peg it into place. So part of the reason why I wanted to make this just a really tight, snug fit is I'm not going to glue it together. Well, I might. I haven't decided yet, but my plan is to not glue it, just peg it. That way the whole thing can be disassembled. While I was taking out all this material, I had this idea to use that little cutter there just to cut in the edges, and that would make it a lot easier and faster for me to cut in, chunk out a ton of material with the chisel set there. And it actually worked pretty well, worked a lot better than I was expecting it to. But there's just a ton of back and forth getting those two components to really have a nice snug fit. But I was able to eventually get it there. And so once I got that kind of snug together and in place, I can go ahead and start prepping this to glue. One of the things that I've done in the past that kind of was a challenge is I didn't mark where the inside was on the outside of the handle material, and that kind of made it a challenge when I went to shape everything and put it together. So for this piece, I decided that's what I was marking there, and now I have it glued. I won't be able to, I'm going to let it sit for probably 24 hours, at least a full day, before I start working on the handle material. I want it to be nice and solid, so I really can't do too much work on that. And so the remainder of work that I'm going to be doing here is just finishing up. So I'm going to be finishing up all of these fine edges, sanding the entire piece down to 320 grit. And then once I have everything sanded and cleaned up, I can go ahead and prep it for putting in the teeth. Now there's, again, a lot of back and forth work, just making sure all of the edges look nice and clean. I want them to be crisp. I want everything to be in line. And so just a lot of sanding work. If I had a belt sander, it might be a little bit faster, but I just like using what I have. What I'm doing here is I'm wrapping a 320 grit sanding disc around a file. That's really nice for hand sanding in clean lines. And so I use that trick for a little bit. So I'm mixing up the epoxy with wood shavings, and then just putting a small amount of epoxy in the groove. and then I'll be putting the teeth into that epoxy. Now that's not going to be the primary hold. I am going to lash this piece, but the epoxy will help hold it in place. Well, this is all I had time for this week. I hopefully will be done with this by next week. So if you liked the video, leave a like and subscribe, and tune in for part 3, where I'll be finishing up the custom sword. Mahalo nui for everyone that watches, and I'll see you next time. Aloha.